Abraham Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846 and to the presidency in 1860. John Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946 and to the presidency in 1960. Two men exactly a century apart. What did the Lincoln presidency mean to liberals in 1960?
Well, that's really a good question. I have a chapter on Abraham Lincoln because when Kennedy was shot, Mrs. Kennedy gave instructions to aides to model the funeral ceremonies on Lincoln. And one of the reasons for this was to suggest that Kennedy, like Lincoln, had been a martyr to the cause of equal rights.
You write, the attempt to cast Kennedy as a martyr alongside Lincoln added even more confusion to an already confused event. Explain why that was a confusion. Why wasn't John Kennedy a martyr?
Well, John Kennedy, as I write, was a martyr to the Cold War, but he was not a martyr to the Civil Rights Movement. He could only be a martyr to the Civil Rights Movement if the assassin was motivated by issues arising from civil rights, which was not the case. Oswald was not a bigot. People said he was a bigot, that Kennedy was killed because of bigotry and prejudice. Oswald was not that at all. Oswald was for civil rights. Oswald was a communist. So that from the standpoint of 1960, of course, the civil rights movement represented a kind of a second reconstruction, as it was called. We are now revisiting all the issues.
Finishing the great unfinished work of Abraham Lincoln.
Absolutely. So, and of course, though Lincoln was the founder of the Republican Party, to liberals and advocates of civil rights, Lincoln was in that pantheon along with FDR as one of the heroes of liberalism and American democracy. So there was definitely an attempt to place Kennedy in the Lincoln tradition when he was killed. I say that added confusion to the event because, as I say, Kennedy and all the facts surrounding Kennedy's assassination suggest that he was assassinated for reasons linked to foreign policy in the Cold War, not to civil rights.
Now, you quote Mrs. Kennedy as saying, quote, he didn't even have the satisfaction of being killed for civil rights. It had to be some silly little communist, close quote. That's Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. Why did she think of the communist of being silly? You make the case he was killed by a communist. He was a martyr to the Cold War. If we know anything about John Kennedy, one thing he took seriously in his life, what we now know is that he was an ironist. He didn't take the vows of his church particularly seriously. He misbehaved. But one thing he took seriously was the Cold War. He wanted to stand up to the Soviets, and he wanted, in one way or another, to win in the Cuban Missile Crisis. We now think of him as very cool and calm and collected. He was, but at every step of the way, he was utterly firm. He did put down in place an embargo on Cuba. He did back Khrushchev down. Why was it insufficient to his own people, to liberals in America, to think of him as a martyr to the Cold War? Why did they have to create what was, if it's not a fiction, it certainly doesn't comport with the facts of the case? Why?
This is a very good question. At this time, many liberals were beginning to believe that the Cold War was a diversion from the real problems of our society, civil rights being one and poverty being another. John F. Kennedy didn't believe that. John F. Kennedy was devoted to fighting the Cold War, and I think you're right. I think John F. Kennedy was thinking, how can we win the Cold War? And he placed his immense rhetorical gifts at the service of fighting this battle. You quoted from his first inaugural address, which was a very eloquent plea to the American people and to the world to stand up for freedom.
As tough as it could have been.
Absolutely. He saw that quotation that you just cited. That sounds like George W. Bush today. But this was a view that liberals more or less abandoned by the end of the 1960s, I would say. And many were beginning to move in this direction, which suggested that we were placing too much attention on the Cold War. We should begin to work on domestic issues. And one of the other things that comes out of the 1960s is this idea that the emphasis on economic growth and national security is far too narrow for the liberal agenda. The liberal agenda ought to be directed at elevating the quality of life and at focusing on cultural issues.